Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise just to make a few brief remarks about the National Security Legislation Amendment Bill No. 1 of 2014, doing so both in a capacity as a member of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, and also chairing the Government's Legal Affairs Policy Committee, which has carriage of these matters. Firstly, could I just reject outright the imputation that was just raised about motivations of the government, that somehow this whole move towards this legislation and these measures is a response to wanting to divert attention away from other issues. It's an outrageous claim, and particularly given the claims have been made. I'll take that interjection, Senator Ludlam. They've been made both last night in the program that was referred to, as well as by many people, and the claims that have come out, or the orders that have come out from ISIL just in the last 24 hours, highlight the fact that there is a real risk that the government needs to respond to make sure that its intelligence agencies have appropriate legislative basis for their actions to protect Australia. I also reject outright the claim that somehow it is our foreign policy that has made us victims or targets of terror. To look at the things such as the Bali bombings that targeted Australia, those occurred before Australia became involved in a military sense in the Middle East. And it is a statement by these organisations that they reject the very nature of our way of life, a plural, liberal, secular democracy, as a form of government where individuals' rights, an individual's right to hold their own freedom of belief and conscience, as opposed to a centrally directed approach, they reject that outright, and that's why we are a target, and that's why we need to take appropriate measures to support the security of our nation. Now, this bill doesn't, in fact, present an annual increase of powers, as Senator Ludlam has just claimed. In actual fact, it's a package of targeted reforms to modernise and improve the legislative framework that govern the activities of the Australian intelligence community. It principally amends two pieces of legislation, being the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation Act of 1979 and the Intelligence Services Act of 2001. One of the important things to remember is that this is not something the government has just cooked up. It has come predominantly about because of the report last year of the Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, as well as a number of recommendations from other agencies, but predominantly from that report. So it's been a process, and part of the reason that process has been there is a recognition of the fact that the two acts that we're talking about are quite dated in a number of areas, some at the sharp end in terms of being operational, some at the administrative end, just in terms of things like employment practices and how we go about employing people. So there's a range of measures encapsulated in this which are just going to the process of due diligence by a government with strong bipartisan support. And I want to put on my record here my respect and gratitude to Mr Anthony Byrne from the other place, who's the Deputy Chair of the Committee from the Opposition, who worked in a very constructive manner with the government to process the review of this piece of legislation. And I won't talk too much more about that report because I will be tabling that on behalf of the committee and will be speaking to that subsequently. The important point from a national security perspective, though, is that we have layers of security to protect our community, but the most important layer, the most effective layer, is intelligence. With effective intelligence, all the other layers become far more effective. Without intelligence, the other layers become quite reactive. It's a bit like the walls that were built in history to try and protect us or protect countries from other attacking forces, and the attacker will find ways around them. Intelligence is one of our most important aspects of defence, and if our agencies are to remain effective, they have to be supported by legislation that allows them to respond rapidly to emerging security threats, both domestic and global. To this end, the bill contains measures that address some of the practical limitations in the current legislation. As I said, they've been identified by the Parliamentary Joint Committee. And the Attorney-General has indicated, I know Senator Ludlam's talked about the fact that we're debating a bill that we're not sure what is there. Well, we have seen the bill. The Attorney-General has issued a media release saying that the government will accept the 17 recommendations of the Parliamentary Joint Committee, and he's also indicated in that release that they will be tabled, and during the committee stage, just like amendments from other political parties dealt with in the committee stage, the government will be tabling those so we can deal with them and we can debate them, and people like Senator Ludlam can ask questions in the appropriate process, which is the committee stage of the Senate. Just briefly to outline the key areas that this bill goes to, as I said, it's looking at modernising a number of statutory employment issues. Some of these haven't actually been updated for over 30 years, and they need to be updated. It's modernising and streamlining the warrant-based intelligence collection powers for ASIO. One of the things that we've seen in this most recent wave of atrocities committed around the world and here in Australia is the use of social media. When some of this legislation was written, people still conceived of a computer as a great big box in one room, as opposed to smartphones, social media and other networks that we now have that are commonly used by people who are committing crimes. And so clearly the legislative basis that underpins the work of ASIO and other agencies needs to recognise the developments in technology so that they can take appropriate actions to respond to developing threats. There are a number of safeguards that are put in place, and a lot of the work that was done by the Parliamentary Joint Committee in reviewing this bill was to look at how we could increase the safeguards, and particularly IGIS, the independent body that is set up to oversight. The comment was made before that the Parliament has no idea of how some of these measures or some of these powers are being used. Well, that is not correct, because IGIS is the body which is set up as an independent body with deep probing powers to monitor what goes on within our intelligence services. And part of the reason it's important to get this debate right is that we have to balance both the public interest and transparency with not only the effectiveness of the agency but the safety of the agents confirmed. And so particularly going to the issue of SIOs, the intelligence operations that are essentially undercover operations, what is one person's whistleblowing motive? They might see something they think is inappropriate, put out in the public space, not only potentially makes the operation ineffective, but very literally it puts at risk the lives of people who are serving their nation and seeking to keep our communities safe. So part of the process that the committee has looked at is to say, how can we make sure that we make very explicit in this legislation the fact that IGIS exists and that people who go to IGIS with legitimate concerns are exempted from the parts of the legislation that make disclosure about an SIO inappropriate. And so that is one of the ways that the committee is looking to make sure that we find that balance between saying there is a public interest in being able to hold an organisation to account, and IGIS is there to do that, but at the same time, what one person sees as legitimate whistleblowing can literally be a death sentence for somebody who is serving their nation. And so we need to get that balance right, and I believe that the committee's report and the legislation and the government's acceptance of those recommendations will achieve that. In conclusion, Mr Acting Deputy President, as I said, I will be talking about the committee's report in some more detail when I table that in the Senate later this week, but I do strongly support both the intent of the government in the National Security Legislation Amendment Bill, and again I welcome the bipartisan support of the opposition in this matter.